most offices have not done a proper formal risk assessment, nor do they have a HIPAA management plan in place. It's the law. You have to do it. It's not optional. There's nothing in HIPAA that says, you don't have to do it. The challenge with it is that if you actually look at the HIPAA laws about doing a risk assessment, it's literally one sentence. It says you have to do it. There's no guidance.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Raving Patients Podcast, sponsored by Cloud Dentistry and Paradental. Thank you for joining us today. I'm super excited today. I'm actually going to be discussing a very hot topic nowadays, especially because of all of the cybersecurity going out there, the ransomware that's out there. Today's topic is Cybersecurity 101, how not to make a $50,000 mistake. My guest today is someone I've known. I actually had him out to my office back in 2007 when I first bought my practice. He came out to do a site visit for my practice. So we've known each other for a long time. I actually heard about him on Dental Town when I was a newbie dentist. And he's really big. He's known as a digital dentist. Please welcome Dr. Lorne Lavine. Lorne, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Len. Pleasure to be here and looking forward to talking with your audience today.
So for those that may not know who you are, okay, and you've got a name for yourself, so it may not be that many that don't know who you are, but for those that don't, just can you give a brief introduction about who you are, kind of your background, how you're helping dentists today?
Sure. And you and I, you know my background, but I was a practicing periodontist for 10 years in Vermont. I had heard that California had passed licensure by credential. I knew I wanted to do something besides doing perio. I really enjoyed IT. So I moved out to LA when they passed it in 2002, unaware of the fact that there were 15,000 people on the waiting list and it was going to be a year before I could get my license. So started doing what I'm doing now full time. And by the time I could get my license, I was like, no, I don't want to go back and do perio. I didn't love it the first time around. So why do I want to do it again? And I just love what I do. So basically what I do is I work with dental offices all over North America as full service IT. In the past, the focus was on computers and networking and sensors and cameras, and we still do that every day. When HIPAA became, a thing back in 2009 with the HITECH Act, I was somewhat surprised to see that a lot of dental IT companies weren't focusing on that as something to offer to offices. It's certainly as of 2013, when it became the omnibus rules and final HIPAA laws, we really felt that this was a service that we could provide to offices. We've been doing that for the last 8-9 years. And as you mentioned, over the last 3 years or so, cybersecurity, ransomware has really been what we've been focusing on. I mean, it's almost impossible to not go onto your favorite news website and hear about the latest ransomware attack. I mean, I was watching the Super Bowl on Sunday, and there was a banner that came across the bottom of the screen about how the San Francisco 49ers had just been hit with ransomware. So it just permeates all of society, and certainly dental offices. There's many, many examples in the news of dental offices being hit. So that's what we do, is we help offices with their infrastructure, with planning for ransomware protection, for getting HIPAA compliant all over the country. Most of our clients, even though I'm based in Southern California, most of our clients are East Coast and Midwest. So the distance is never an issue for us. We've been working remotely for 20 plus years.
Awesome. So I think the most important question I wanted to ask you, and I just thought of this right now, is what makes dentists such a target for these types of ransomware and cybersecurity attacks?
It's well known in the black market, not that I am a black market expert by any stretch of the imagination, that a health record is far and away the most valuable asset out there. Because you think about what's in your typical dental record. You've got the patient name, their chart ID, their date of birth, their address, their phone number. Very good chance you got their social security number in there, a copy of their driver's license, credit card information. I mean, all of that in one record. So you've got these records that are unbelievably valuable, especially for people that are interested in some type of identity theft, because you just have all that information there. The other thing, of course, is that they know that dental offices, for the most part, even though, we're seeing more and more DSOs, still the majority of dental offices are solo practitioners or small group practices. We just don't have the resources that, say, a hospital or a health organization would have to protect themselves. So, it's a combination of very valuable data and not best practices when it comes to protecting and securing that data that makes us such a good target.
And that's what I thought the answer would be, but I wanted you to say it, not for me to say it. So thank you for answering that.
Sure.
So let's talk about somebody calls you up. Let's say they're not a new practice, but they want to kind of determine whether what they have to do to become, I guess, to prevent an attack like this. Can you talk about what you do with offices? I'm assuming you do some type of assessment with them.
We do. So, that's the beauty of having had my dental background, is that one of the things I learned very early on in the game of dentistry is that it's really, really hard to treatment plan unless you diagnose first. New patient would come in and I'd be doing my perioprobing and restorative charting and take my x-rays and intraoral, extraoral exam, all that type of stuff, develop my treatment plan, and then go ahead and start treating them. Cybersecurity, HIPAA is exactly the same process. How do you know where you're at in the HIPAA scale of things? How do you know if you're following best practices for cybersecurity if you don't look? So we decided years ago, we don't want this to be a barrier to entry. We're going to do this for free. Where if someone goes to our website, and at the end, I can give you some links because we have, you can either call me up or you can take an actual quiz online to see where you're at. But it always starts with that evaluation. We call it a security audit or a tech audit. Usually takes about 20, 30 minutes. It's not designed to be a formal HIPAA risk assessment, which typically would take 5, 7, 8 hours. This is more that 30,000 foot view from above. Let's see where you're at. There's certain things we can see by logging on to the network as far as, do you have antivirus in place? What are you doing for backup? But there's other things that we wouldn't be able to see that we have to ask about. How are you emailing patients in other offices? When's the last time you did that risk assessment? It's questions like that we just don't know from doing an evaluation of the network. And once we gather all that data, then I do a phone call with the dentist and say, listen, here's what we found. Here's the things that we think are the highest risk. Here's the ones that maybe not, critical, but really need to be addressed at some point. Here are my recommendations on how to deal with that. Here are your options. Here's what everything would cost. And then it's up to them. I mean, it's never my philosophy or my goal to point a gun in someone's head and say, do this or else. The fact is that every single thing that we do, other than insurance, which we don't provide insurance, we just set them up with an insurance carrier. Every service that we do has an associated HIPAA law. So it's not like I can say to an office, hey, this is optional, don't worry about it, because the fact is, if you're ever audited, you'll definitely be worrying about it. So, but we know that there's certain key things that if you're audited, that they're going to look at more closely than other things. So yeah, the basic process is diagnose first, treatment plan, and then go ahead and start treating.
Perfect. Now, if someone's listening to this podcast and they're wondering, just by some of the things you said, if they are at more of a risk than not, what are some things that they can just think of just as they're watching or listening to this that says I may be at more risk than others when it comes to this? So what are some things you see normally when it comes to their network or the way they're doing things in the office? Because I know I get emails from dentists and they're not using anything HIPAA compliant. So can you talk about some really, really easy things that they say, you know what, this is important, I need to look into this?
Sure. So we tend to take a three-pronged approach to dealing with HIPAA and cybersecurity. Number one, are you doing everything you can to keep the bad guys out? Secondarily, if they do get in, do you have proper protocols in place or proper things in place to deal with that, we call it malware or viruses? And number three, if all else fails, do you have a fallback? Do you have some type of security in place? So the things that will normally jump out is, first, does an office have a real firewall in place? Every cable modem out there has a built-in firewall. There's nothing in the HIPAA law that says this firewall is compliant and this isn't. That being the case, as with anything in life, you get what you pay for. And there's no doubt that the firewall is built into your router. And we see a lot of offices that have home routers like Linksys and Netgear. They're not ideal. They'll get the job done, but there are better ones out there like Sophos and SonicWall and, business class firewalls. So that's usually the first thing that we'll see is that they don't have that dedicated firewall. Secondarily, what we look at when it comes to, well, let's assume that the ransomware has gotten in, is, what do you have to deal with that? Almost every office has some type of antivirus software in place. They oftentimes will use the built-in stuff that's in Windows. It's called Defender. It's mediocre at best. We would normally recommend anti-ransomware specific software like Intercept X or Hitman Pro. The new technology that has got me really excited is this whole concept of application whitelisting. And we've never done an evaluation of an office that had this in place yet. We've only been doing it ourselves for about 8-9 months. But the whole concept with application whitelisting, the best analogy I can give you is think of, there's a private party that you heard about, you weren't invited, but you decide you want to go. And you show up at the door, there is a very large bouncer with a very small list of names on it. The fact is, if your name isn't on that list, you ain't getting in. That's the concept of application whitelisting, is that we have a list of all the good programs out there. We compare it. We run software on your system to take an inventory of those programs. Compare that. We have about 350 active clients that we currently work with. So we have this big global database of all the good software. If any software isn't on that list and it tries to run, and all viruses, ransomware are just tiny little programs, it literally gets stopped in its tracks. So that's usually the second thing that we would look for, is do they have protection in place? The third thing is the backup. It is such a critical thing, and most offices do not have a HIPAA compliant or a proper backup. That maybe they're backing up the data, but they haven't thought through the process of, well, if my server goes down, how long is it going to take me to get up and running? Having a copy of your data doesn't do you a lot of good if your server's down, because you got to get a server in there. You've got to reinstall your software programs, reconfigure the whole network. You're talking potentially days of downtime. We set up systems where the downtime is measured in minutes, not in hours or days. And of course, there are HIPAA rules that it has to be encrypted. You have to test it and verify it. So almost every office, when we work with them, will have a backup in place. It just may not be what we would consider to be HIPAA compliant or allow the office to get up and running. So those three things: if we don't see a firewall, we don't see anti-ransomware software, we don't see a proper backup, that's the three things that we know off the bat. Hey, these are the things that we're probably going to focus on initially to make sure that we've got adequate protection in place for the practice.
Gotcha. Now that makes a lot of sense. And guys, if you're listening to this and you fall one into those categories, like, do you know if your backup's being done? Do you know if it works? Do you don't have these things set up? You may be target of some ransomware in the future. And I mean, that will cost you a lot of money from what I'm reading. So I know we talked about why dentists are, I guess, this is common in the dental space just because of the opportunity available to them. But why is it important for somebody to say, okay, this is something I need to do again? Why do I need to make sure I cover all this? So can you talk about the background or what this whole thing is with ransomware and making sure you're protected and the whole cybersecurity thing?
Yeah, so there's two basic concepts here. First off, ransomware is just devastating to a practice. For people that aren't familiar with ransomware, and it's interesting that when I first started really trying to focus on ransomware for office, and I would be talking to a potential new client, they'd say, yeah, I've heard about it. I saw something in the news. Now, over the last few months, when I talk to somebody, it's, oh yeah, we've had 2 offices in town that I know of that have already been hit. I mean, it's just much more pervasive than it was years ago. Certainly with COVID, with people being out of their offices, that was a gold mine for some of these ransomware criminals, because they could get in, because people still had to have remote access to get into their offices, but they literally couldn't get in. They physically weren't there, and it was open season at that point. So the challenge with ransomware is that it does lock your files. There is no way to unlock the file yourself, and it's got some type of encryption code. I mean, you could spend a few million years trying to break the code, but good luck with that. It won't happen. So you've got these files that are locked. In the past, we would say, well, if you've got a good backup, then just restore the backup. There's 2 potential problems with that. Number one, a lot of the ransomware viruses are able to hit backups as well. We haven't seen it that frequently, but it is within the realm of possibility. So that's number one. The other thing, of course, is that what they're now doing is what we call double extortion or triple extortion. They know, these criminals know that, hey, there's a decent chance you got a backup. So they're going to try to extort money from you. You're going to tell them to take a hike or not respond. And then they'll say, okay, well, you don't want to do that because you've got a backup. Great. We happen to take a copy of your data. We're going to post it online. And that's the double extortion. The triple is if they are able to get into that database and say, not only do we have a copy of your database, we can access it and we see the patient's names here and we see their phone numbers. We're going to start calling them up and tell them that, that we've got your data. So they make sure. So you're looking at, all the fines and penalties associated with it. It's considered, standard of care to provide some type of credit monitoring for patients if you've suffered this. The other way that ransomware, I think, is really devastating to a practice, and a lot of people don't know this, is that if you are hit with ransomware, by law, you have suffered a HIPAA breach. We don't normally think of breaches in those terms. We think of a breach as, well, someone hacked into your network, or, you lost an external hard drive or laptop. The Office of Civil Rights, Health and Human Services, they define a breach as loss of control of your data, which is exactly what a ransomware does. It locks your files. Unlike a lot of HIPAA, which is somewhat ambiguous and open to interpretation, the breach notification is set in stone, and it's very clear that if you suffered a breach, number one, you have to be notify the local news media. Number two, be listed on the Health and Human Services website. We call it the Wall of Shame. It's not a place you want to be. But the worst part is that the third thing is that you have to send a letter, not an email, not a posting on your door, but a letter to every patient of record, notifying them that there was a breach, what data may have been breached. And again, we're usually talking about credit card information, social security numbers. You're going to lose a significant portion of your patient population if you have to send out that letter. So between, the downtime of days and lost revenue and having to, deal with all that and having to declare a breach, for those reasons, I think that keeping ransomware off of your system in the first place really should be the focus of every dental practice out there. The other thing that we haven't talked about yet, but I think is really kind of critical. Back in 2019, it was all over the news. There were 400 offices in Wisconsin that were all hit at once. And there were 100 offices in Colorado that were all hit at once. And the reason they were hit is that it wasn't really the dental offices that were the problem. It was their IT provider. In IT, we all use these web-based portals to access all the computers. The portal that I use for my business, we have 1,800 computers in there that we have access to at any one time. If, God forbid, someone got into that portal, they would have access to all 1,800 computers. They could push out ransomware to all those people at once, which is exactly what happened for those offices in Wisconsin and Colorado. So it's not enough to make sure that you're doing what you need to do to protect yourself. You need to have a conversation with your IT provider to make sure that they're following best practices, to make sure that their portal is safe and secure, that they're using some type of two-factor authentication or other methods. Because if they get hit, all bets are off and there's nothing you can do at that point.
So yeah, you answered one of the questions I had was, are you responsible if you get hit with a cyber attack? And you are responsible. You are having some major problems. I mean, the damage that it could do financially just from you, it could exceed what you have to pay the ransom, basically. So.
Yeah, well, that's why we titled this podcast, how not to make a $50,000 mistake, because that's typically going to be at the lowest end. HIPAA violations for first-time offense, the lowest level of HIPAA fines where they classify as that you didn't know there was a violation and realistically shouldn't have known that there was a violation. Those are $25,000 to $50,000 fines, and it goes up from there. And certainly, you have the far end, which is called willful neglect, which is, hey, you knew about this and you didn't do anything about it. We always, anytime we do a risk assessment for an office and do a management plan for them, we always bundle in at least $250,000 of cyber liability insurance. We never use the term, we can get you 100% compliant. It's impossible. There's 700 pages of rules and regulations. And the ones you hear about in the news, these are typically healthcare organizations that have full-time HIPAA compliance officers on their payroll. If they can't get compliant, what chance do you have as a dentist? But it doesn't mean you can't work towards it. It's just, if anyone ever promises you, hey, we can get you 100% compliant, we can 100% guarantee you'll pass a HIPAA audit, run for the hills. There's just no way that anyone can make that promise.
I mean, I hear about it. Like I said, it's amazing to me when I read the stories that are out there about what can happen to a practice when they get hit with this. I just can't imagine the stress. I'm almost glad I'm not an owner because of this type of stuff anymore. I don't have to deal with this. That's really interesting though. So can you share some stats, like really anything that you think would rattle someone's chains listening to this about the stats when it comes to cybersecurity?
Yeah, so there was some stats that came out a few months ago. One's off the top of my head is that around 2/3 of all organizations worldwide have been attacked with ransomware. It hasn't necessarily gotten through and affected all of them, but it's affected almost everybody. The stat that really jumped out the most to me was that for the people that ended up paying the ransom, on average, they're only recovering 69% of the data, which means you can go through all this whole rigmarole. You're down for multiple days. You're paying the ransom. You get the unlock key. You run that unlock. You get the key, which is not always a guarantee either. You run that unlock key, and you still have a third of your data that is unrecoverable. Now, I know you were a Dentrix user. I mean, yes, there's certain files that maybe you don't care because they're program files. But if it's the dentrix.dat file is one of those files that they can't recover, you're dead in the water. You've lost everything. So it affects almost everybody. Healthcare, as I said, is a huge target. And people need to understand that even if they do everything right and pay the ransom and get the unlock key, there's a good chance that close to a third of their data will not be recoverable no matter what they do.
Wow, that's an amazing stat. Anything else that you think rings a bell?
I'm just trying to think off the top of my head. It's just I had a slide when I do my webinar sometimes where I just go through all these statistics. Only 44% of people that are hit with ransomware have a good backup. I mean, that number just kind of blows me away. Why isn't it 94%? Doesn't everybody have a backup? More than half the people out there don't have a proper backup in place that protect them. So,
and why do you think that is?
A lot of dental offices like to do it themselves. We work with a lot of practices. The unfortunate reality is that ransomware has driven more people to my business than it ever like anything else in the past. I've been very fortunate that I never had to do a whole ton of formal marketing, quote unquote. I'm active on Dental Town and people see my webinars or I lecture all over the place. And that's how we've always got clients in. The ransomware threat has really kind of scared people because they realize this isn't something that they necessarily know how to deal with on their own. That, they think they've got a backup in place. They think they've got good antivirus in place. They think they've got firewalls in place, but they know that they don't really have everything in place for ransomware. And it's just devastating when it happens. And that's why we put so much emphasis with offices that we work with on prevention. Make sure it never happens to you in the first place versus having to deal with it once it gets in. One of the challenges with ransomware and viruses in general is that we're seeing more and more what we call zero-day viruses, which is just basically a fancy way of saying that it's so new, your firewall, your antivirus software doesn't know that it's a virus. It doesn't know what to do with it, which is why you need to have, something like application whitelisting or ring fencing or making sure you've got a good backup in place because nothing that you do is foolproof.
Gotcha. Now that makes a lot of sense. So moving on from cybersecurity and I want to talk a little bit about HIPAA compliance as a general, because there's, people think HIPAA is a waste and they don't follow proper protocols, but it's a real thing. So talk about HIPAA and then I want to talk a little bit about backups and type of backups that are out there now. So from a HIPAA compliance standpoint, can you talk about where offices are really lacking? Again, I think like the communications that's taking place between yourself and other doctors or yourself and the patients. I think a lot of the offices who are not on email, a HIPAA compliant email are in trouble there. So can you talk on that topic?
Sure. So the biggest risk that we see, and I use that word, emphasis risk, is that most offices, and we talked about the need to diagnose before your treatment plan. Most offices have not done a proper formal risk assessment, nor do they have a HIPAA management plan in place. It's the law. You have to do it. It's not optional. That there's nothing in HIPAA that says, you don't have to do it. The challenge with it is that if you actually look at the HIPAA laws about doing a risk assessment, it's literally one sentence. It says you have to do it. There's no guidance. There is a document out there by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's document 800-30. It tells you how to do a risk assessment. If you suffer from insomnia, it's a great cure for that. It's 95 pages of the driest thing you've ever read. But, Reader's Digest version is what you would expect. You got to be thorough and comprehensive. And one of my pet peeves is that there are companies out there that used to be like OSHA, OSHA compliance, and now they're OSHA HIPAA compliance. And to me, they could not be further apart. It's like having a dental practice that you also offer TV repair. It's just they're not related in any way. And what we see are some of these people, because there's nothing in the HIPAA laws that says exactly how to do it, they'll tell people, hey, go online and take this 15-minute questionnaire and boom, you've done your risk assessment. And I promise you will get laughed at by the HIPAA auditor if they're in a good mood, and they'll say, no, seriously, where's your risk assessment? Not this. It's not a risk assessment. As I mentioned earlier, when we do it for our clients, it usually takes about 5 to 8 hours. We only need you for 5-10 minutes of that just to get us onto the systems. But the whole process takes multiple hours, and you have to generate their version of the treatment plan called the HIPAA management plan. If you're ever audited, that's the first thing they're going to ask for. Show us your management plan. It's not so much that you need to have completed everything on there, because when we do it for our clients, it's oftentimes 8-9 pages of stuff. They want to see that you've at least started, that you've made a good faith effort to start the process. When we do risk assessments, we tend to see a number of things that will tend to jump out at us. We see that a lot of offices aren't encrypted. Even though encryption is what we call an addressable concern, which means that, you don't necessarily have to do it if there's a good alternative, which there isn't. So, most offices haven't encrypted their server and their workstations, which again kind of surprises me because the encryption software that we use, which is called BitLocker, it's built into Windows. Every version of Windows Server from 2012 onward and Windows 10, they have BitLocker built into it. It's free. If you don't know what you're doing, you'll probably want to pay for an IT company to help you set it up. But it's not like you're spending thousands of dollars on special software. It's already there. How you communicate with other offices and with patients. It has to be encrypted unless the patient is opted out. And it has to be a written opt-out. You just can't say to you verbally, "Oh, it's okay. You can email Dr. Tao through regular Gmail. I'm okay with that." There has to be something in writing. And a lot of offices don't have that. Most of the better encrypted email systems out there will allow you to use your existing email address. So it's not like you've got to change anything. Other things that we tend to see from a HIPAA standpoint, most people aren't doing what's called patch management. It is a law that you have to keep your computers current and up to date. That's the reason why a lot of offices were probably contacted by their IT people back in January of 2020 to tell them, hey, Microsoft's no longer supporting Windows 7. You've got to replace it with Windows 10. It wasn't the lack of support that was the issue. It was the lack of patches. Once they stopped patching it, you had a big security risk. So you have to, and it's not just Windows, it's Office, it's Adobe, it's every software they're using has to be current and up to date. We tend to see a lot of offices that they haven't done staff training. You really have to do some type of training as well. Many offices don't have a proper manual. They buy the ADA manual. They don't crack the plastic on it. They stick it up on their shelf. And if they had cracked the plastic and opened it up, what they would see is that the ADA manual is a template. It's just a bunch of empty spaces where you've got to fill in all this information. So, those are the types of things that we tend to see. We focus on everything that we've talked about. The 9 or 10 things, the risk assessment, the management plan, the insurance, the patching, the backup, the firewalls, the antivirus software, the staff training. Those are the key things. As I said, you can go crazy trying to get compliant and you can go through all 700 plus pages and do your best. But we know from experience that if you kind of focus on those 9 or 10 things and you're audited, they're going to see that, hey, this is an office that's made a good faith effort. we see a couple things that are a little deficient. We're going to give them a HIPAA remediation plan, which basically says, hey, get these things addressed. We're not going to fine you or penalize you. We may come back at some point. Just get these handled. On the flip side, if they come in, you've never done a formal risk assessment, you don't have a HIPAA management plan, it goes downhill very quickly from there. So you really want to kind of get your ducks in a row. If you get notified that you are being audited, you typically have between 7 and 10 days before they show up. Some of the stuff you can do in that time, but a lot of it you can't. So you want to make sure that you got it in place before you get that notification of an audit.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. And the last topic I just wanted to ask you about again was, backup recovery. Backup is very different than it was. If you're doing tape backup still, you're way behind the times. And I'm sure that people are. Because they don't know.
There's still a few stragglers.
Can you touch base on the different types of tape or backups that there are, and how to make sure your backup is actually running properly or has the data in there properly?
Sure. So, and keep in mind, it's no different. If a patient goes to 5 dentists, they're going to get 5 different treatment plans. Same thing with backup. You go to 5 IT providers, you're going to get 5 different recommendations. The one that we recommend for our clients is basically based on 2 principles. Number 1 is going to allow you to get up and running quickly. And number 2 is going to save your behind if what hits the fan and the office burns down or there's a theft or flood or something like that. So our first backup is the local backup. 99.99% of the restores that we've done over 20 plus years have been that local backup. We don't recommend doing just a data backup because I said, that's not going to be, if your server goes down, having the data, it's nice to have it, but it's not going to get you up and running quickly. What we recommend is that you do what's called an image. It's an exact duplicate of the entire server, not just the data, but the program files, the network settings, everything. In theory, you could buy a second server to do that. You don't have to do that. You could put it on an external hard drive. What we would normally recommend is that you get like a souped up Dell computer with a large hard drive. We make a virtual copy of the server that goes on that device, and we update it daily. If your server goes down for any particular reason, we fire up that virtual copy of the server, and within minutes, as far as the rest of the network is concerned, the server's back up and running. You can go ahead and pull up your Dentrix data. You can go ahead and take x-rays. You can take a month to fix the server because you've got a copy of the server running there. By HIPAA regulations, they say that your backup has to be retrievable. And what that really means is offsite, that you've got to have something offsite in case there's some type of major disaster. In the past, we had people doing external hard drives that they would take home with them. We've tried to get people away from that just because we want to eliminate that human component. You've got better things to do with your day than sit there and run the backup. Most dental offices don't know how to test and verify the backup, so you don't really know that it's really good or not. So what we've always, not always, but certainly over the last 15 plus years, I think cloud backup is really the way to go. You want to use some type of secure HIPAA compliant provider. We don't recommend ones like Mozy or Carbonite. We do it ourselves, but certainly there are ones out there that are HIPAA compliant, but you need something that's going to be offsite as well. What we've actually found over the last few months is some offices are asking about adding in that external hard drive backup because of the fear of ransomware. The way that we set up our backup is that if there's a corruption with the local backup, the cloud portion won't run. So we have yet to see a cloud backup hit with ransomware. We've seen certainly local backups hit with it, but not the cloud version as well. But that being the case, we do have some clients that say, I'd still maybe feel a little bit better if not only that I had this local copy of my server and a cloud backup, but that I had a copy of the data on a drive that I disconnect and take out of the office. We call that air gapping, where there's literally air between your backup and the server. And we're saying, fine, if you want to do that, the more the merrier. It's one of those situations where it's okay to wear a belt and suspenders at the same time. We want to have as much protection as possible. So, local backup, some type of offsite backup, whether it's cloud, external hard drive, or a combination of the two. Testing, it has to be tested and verified on a regular basis. The best way to do that is turn off your server and start the clock. How long is it going to take you to get up and running? But if you hit hour 2 or hour 3 and you're still not up, then it's time to probably reevaluate how you're doing your backup.
Awesome. Well, we went through a lot of things. I had some other questions for you, but I don't want to keep the audience waiting. They were waiting for us to say sayonara. So if people want to find out more information about what you do and want to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to do that?
So 2 ways. You can go to my website, which is digitaldentist.com. On that front page here, you'll see, complimentary consultation. You just fill in your name, phone number, email. It'll send an email to us. My office manager, Candace, will call you up and say, hey, or just send an email and say, hey, how can we help? And I'm usually the first step is to set up a phone call with me, no charge. I'm happy to just answer questions that you have, tell you how the process works, how we can assist you, or maybe just want to pick my brain, just want to ask, hey, this is what we're doing. What do you think, Lauren? What would you recommend? I'm always happy to have a conversation. If you're not a talker and you say, hey, I'd rather just I want to see where I'm at before I'm ready to make that phone call, I have another website called, it's at go.thedigital.dentist.com, where I've got what's called my security predictor checklist. It's a 7-point checklist that you just go through the steps. It takes 5-7 minutes to go through it. And you'll be able to see for yourself where you are on the scale of being cyber secure, being HIPAA compliant. And if that's, usually in a lot of cases, when people do that, they say, yeah, I think I'm ready for that conversation. I think it's time to see, if I'm doing all that I can do. So those are the 2 best ways to get a hold of me. I mean, people, Dental Town, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, I'm on all those places as well.
Okay, awesome. This was great information. I think the audience is really going to get a lot out of this. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise with the listeners and the viewers. Guys, if you like the episode, please share it. Please let your colleagues know. It comes out Friday at 5 a.m. Check out your subscription and get the latest episodes every week. Please review us. Please, recommend us to your friends and family. We're trying to grow this podcast even bigger than what it is. And as I always end in these podcasts, remember, your reputation matters. Until the next episode, Lorne, thank you so much for engaging us so well, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much for having me.